So the next step now is to actually override the way that PHP handles exception, and then tell it that we want to use our own custom exception handler. So we can basically do that in a very few steps. First thing to do is to actually create our own exception handler. So we're going to create an exception handler. So let's just call it exception handler. All right. And the inside of here, we want to have one method. So we're going to say public function handle. So this is going to be the method that actually handles the exception. So we want to use this as our callback when we actually call the PHP function that is going to intercept how PHP we usually handle the exception, and then use our own method instead of using the default. So that is going to actually inject one argument into this method, and that is going to be the exception object. So whatever exception was being thrown will be injected into this method. So we can actually tap into that. So throwable exception, and this should actually be a void. And I mentioned previously the reason why we need to use throwable here, because if we have PHP error exception, that is not part of the exception class, which means that we cannot actually catch it, as illustrated in the previous lecture. So in order for us to be able to handle error exceptions, we need to actually inject the throwable interface. That way we'll be able to handle error exceptions. So another thing that we want to take note of here, and perhaps one of the reasons why we are even creating our own custom exception handler, is because we want to be able to decide what kind of error we want to show based on the environment. So we have already set up things in our application to make it pretty simple. So we're going to say application should be equal to new application. We have our app class, and then we can actually tap into this to see if the application is in debug mode. So if application is in debug mode, then we want to display essentially everything. Okay, so we could just do a var dump of the exception that was injected into this method. So what we essentially do is just throw everything out so that the user can actually get more information about the exception and then easily solve the problem. But if we are not in debug mode, which should be the case when we are in production, we can just echo that something went wrong. Okay, so we could say this should not have happened. So this should not have happened. Please try again. So this is going to be our generic message that we want to actually display if something goes wrong when we are not in debug mode. But when we are in debug mode, we actually want to just throw the entire exception class. So let's try this out again. So inside of index, let's say we want to, first thing we want to do here is to set the exception handler. So we can come here and say set exception handler. It's a PHP function. It's going to take a callback, and a callback is just a string that represents a function that can be called. Okay, so we're going to pass this an array and say we want to get a new instance of the exception handler, which is our own exception class. So that will be exception handler. And then we want to actually specify the method. So this is going to be the handle method. And then here we can actually just give this a try. We could say, let's say config is equal to config get file content, and we want to pass it a file name that doesn't exist. So there is an unhandled exception there. So whenever there is an unhandled exception, this method is actually going to intercept that exception and then pass it over to our own custom class that we created, and it will trigger this method, which will do whatever we ask it to do. So let's do a var dump on this. And actually one more thing that we need to do in this class is to exit. So outside of here we need to exit because we don't want to show anything again. So let's come to index, and then let's do a reload on the browser. Okay, so now we get an exception, and as you can see here, this is throwing an instance of our exception class, which is object app exception not found exception. And you can see here that it actually called our exception handler, and the data property is empty because we didn't pass in anything to the array. If we had passed in some data, then it will be displayed here, which we can easily just illustrate. So let's come back here to config, and then let's pass in data. So that should be the second one. So let's pass in an array and say not found. So that will be a string, not found file data is passed. All right, so I'm going to remove this afterwards. So let's reload again, and then you can see not found file data is passed. All right, so everything works as intended because now we are in debug mode. You can see that we have the stack trace, we have all of the information that can help us to actually debug and fix the exception. So if we are not in debug mode, let's quickly test that. So let's come to config and then app, set debug to false. So it means that now we are not in debug mode. We should just see a very lovely error message. Okay, so this should not have happened. Please try again. Okay, so right now we are able to handle exceptions the way that we want to handle exceptions.